In this lesson, we're going to continue to discuss preferences. If you'd like to follow along, go under the File menu to Open, and in the Sample Files folder, select 0204-0205, What's Your Preference, and just click Open. Why don't we get right back into preferences? On a Mac, hit Command-K, on a PC, Control-K. And we're going to go down to the Composition section. The default preferences in this particular section are absolutely fine most of the time, unless you're trying to solve a particular problem. Like, let's say I was working on a brochure that was created a long time ago, and I was doing some editing in my layout, and I realized that there was some inconsistent tracking. Well, we haven't talked about tracking yet. If you don't know what tracking is, it's how tight or loose the spacing is between the characters in your type. Well, to find the inconsistent or custom tracking, what I would do is highlight it in the composition section. So if now I click OK and I scroll down to another page, you can see that all of the custom tracking is actually highlighted in a color. Let me go back into my preferences and go to the composition section and just uncheck that. Probably the preference that has changed the most is units and increments. Let me go into units and increments and you'll see why. By default, horizontal and vertical ruler units are in picas. That is the default for InDesign. Now, if I'm here in the United States, chances are pretty good that I may want to use inches instead of picas. If I'm outside of the United States, I may want to use centimeters. If I wanted these to be my default settings in my preferences, I would close all documents, go into Preferences, to Units and Increments, and change it to the ruler units that I want to use for both horizontal and vertical rulers. Then, when I open any new documents, they'll always be using inches. Let's go to the next section, which is grids. Not much here that I normally would want to change. If I go down to the document grid section, you can see that the way the grid is set up, both horizontally and vertically, is there is a major grid line every inch and 8 subdivisions. What if I was using tenths of an inch? I could make it 10 subdivisions so I can more easily see where a tenth of an inch is. But another part of the preferences in grids and document grid is grids in back. If I had my grid on right now, my document grid, any object that is in my layout is going to be in front of the grid because by default grids are in back. Well, let me click OK and show you what might be an issue with that I may want to change it temporarily. I'm going to go to View, Grids and Guides, Show Document Grid. If I was trying to line up these pictures with my grid, I can't see the grid because of this background green object. So in order to be able to line up objects with my grid, I would change my preferences temporarily so that the grid is in front of all the objects. Let me do that. I'm going to go back into my preferences to grids and uncheck grids in back. Well, now I can very easily select these objects and line them up with a grid. But it makes it impossible to look at my layout, which is why they're in the background by default. Let me go back into my preferences to grids and make sure to check grids in back. Let's go into the guide section. Once again, not much here I would ever want to change. Here's an example of when you may want to change something with your guide's preferences. I got a call from one of my ex-students who I had trained quite a few versions ago in InDesign. And she said, my smart guides are not working. And I asked if we could share her screen so I could see what was happening in her layout. And as soon as I saw her layout, I knew exactly what was going on. She was working on a catalog for golf equipment. And all of the backgrounds in the entire layout were green. almost exactly the same as her smart guides. So her smart guides were actually working, she just couldn't see them over the green background. So I told her to temporarily change the color of her smart guides to some color that she's going to be able to see more easily over green, such as brick red. Why don't we go down to display performance? By default, InDesign uses a display performance that is called typical, which is fine. It's a high enough resolution for most layouts. But let's say I was using the defaults down here in the typical section. And for vector graphics, the default is something called proxy. Let me click OK. I'm going to get rid of my grid by going under the View menu to Hide Document Grid. And I'm going to go to my Zoom tool. The way the Zoom tool works, one of the ways, is if you click and drag with your Zoom tool over a certain area, it will fit that area in the screen the best it can. Not too attractive. In typical view, it's using a proxy image, a low-resolution, highly pixelated image for my logos, for my vector graphics. So if I was working on this, I might temporarily change my preferences. Let me go back into Preferences to Display Performance. I may change vector graphics to high resolution and click OK. Now it's not only much easier to look at my logo, but to position it correctly, because I can actually see what it looks like in high resolution. If I didn't want to change my preferences, let me undo that. I'm going to go to Preferences, Display Performance, and drag it back to the default of proxy and just click OK. I could also do this. Go to my View menu, Display Performance, High Quality. This temporarily changes the view on my display to high resolution. Now, another reason why you may think twice before changing your default preferences so that vector graphics are in high resolution, if you are using some very complex vector graphics in your layout, such as an illustration with lots and lots of effects, it could take forever to preview on your screen. So rather than change your preferences, you may want to go under your View menu to Display Performance and choose Typical Display on those particular pages instead of changing your preferences. Why don't we go back into Preferences and go to File Handling? One of the things in file handling that sometimes people like to change is Snippet Import, Position at Cursor Location. Now, we haven't talked about snippets yet, so let me tell you what they are. If you have a selection of objects, you can save that selection as something called a snippet, and then place those objects on another page or another document. Well, the way they're working by default is wherever you click with your cursor is where it's going to place those objects. Well, one of the uses of snippets is, let's say I have a brochure with all of the sign-off information for that brochure on the back page. Well, if it's a campaign of brochures, I may want to have exactly that same sign-off information, my logo, my address, my website, any information that I need on that back panel of my brochure. I may want to save that as a snippet and then place it in exactly the same position in another brochure in that campaign. So instead of cursor location, I may want to choose original location. But there's really no reason to change this default. Let me go back to cursor location. You can keep it at cursor location, and then when you're placing your snippet, as you click, hold down your Shift key. This will actually position the snippet exactly in the same position as the original objects from when you made the snippet. We're going to continue talking about the basics of InDesign in the next lesson.